Welcome to week 9, Social Psychology Online. Today we're going to be talking about persuasion. Persuasion is when other people try to change our attitudes. So you can think about this in the context of attitudes, which we talked about last week. Oftentimes people try to persuade us by using persuasive messages. And whether or not we change our attitudes or our beliefs based on those messages depends in part on how we process that information. There are two routes that we use when we're processing messages. There's the central and the peripheral route. All right, so we talked about this idea that one of the things that our brain does really well for us is to automate tasks. Right? You can think of this in terms of automatically categorizing people as male or female. Well, the central and peripheral route are two different ways that we process information, and they vary in the degree to which they are automated. The central route is relatively unautomated. It is sort of a consciously controlled process. We are paying careful attention to whatever information we're receiving. On the other hand, the peripheral route is more automatic. It's more unconsciously processed. We're not really paying too much attention, too much careful attention to the content of the message. Right? Now, we will take the central route of processing. We're processing centrally when we have a high degree of motivation. Right? So if I tell you the next sentence I'm about to utter is going to be one of the answers to the quiz question this week, you are going to pay a lot of attention to what I'm about to say because you have a high motivation to do so. You will also, there is no question from the quiz, by the way, sorry. Just using that as an example. We will also take the central route when we're cognitively able, right? Again, think about our cognitive capacity, our cognitive abilities as having sort of a limited amount of resources. You can sort of think of a jar of cognition, if you will. And everything that we are doing takes up some of those resources. So if you were driving and you were thinking about what you have to do and you're worried about, getting to your job on time and your kids are screaming in the back seat, right? Your cognitive resources are fully occupied and you are less likely to process information centrally because central processing requires a degree of cognitive capacity. Now, in contrast, when these conditions are not met, when we aren't motivated, when we don't have the cognitive capacity, when we are cognitively busy doing other things, then we will process information peripherally. These are more automated. We'll just sort of half listen to what we are being presented with. Now, there's some caveats to this idea, right? It's not central or peripheral. It's more like a continuum. We're sort of doing bits of both of this. You may phase in and phase out. If you're listening to, let's say, a political advertisement on the radio, and you might be very interested in it at first, centrally processing, but then you hear something that you don't like, or you hear something that doesn't resonate with you, and you might tune out and switch over to more peripheral processing. Even if you're centrally processing, you can still be affected by some of these superficial elements of a message. But generally speaking, the more peripherally you are processing information, the more you will be influenced by superficial elements, which we will talk about here in a little bit. Now, when we talk about persuasive messages, there's three really important things that we're interested in that influence the degree to which we are able to persuade people to change their attitudes. We're really interested in who says what to whom. So who has to do with the qualities of the speaker? Who is the person doing the persuading or trying to persuade you? What is the content of the message? How is the message being presented? What is the information that's in the message? What kind of information are we talking about? And then whom is the characteristics of the audience, right? Certain people might be more persuadable compared to others. Certain people might be more interested in the information compared to others. We'll talk about each of these in turn. All of these things increase or decrease the effectiveness of persuasive messages, but also interact with the kind of processing that you're using. So we're going to do a web activity. This is a real-time live web activity. So what I want you guys to do is open up the PowerPoint presentation on your computer and then click on the link here. And when you click on the link, it's going to take you to a web page and it's going to present you with a quote that was spoken by a person. And what I want you to do is evaluate the degree to which you agree with the quote on the following scale, with 1 is strongly disagree with this idea, 8 is strongly agree with this idea. So pause the web lecture, go to the PowerPoint, click on the link, and then write down your evaluation of the quote, because you're going to need that on the next slide. All right, so I'm going to assume that you've gone through and you've clicked on the link, you've evaluated the quote and written that down in your notes, and we'll continue on. So here's the thing about what we just did. Not everyone saw the same person. Everyone saw the same quote, so everyone who clicked on that link saw the same quote. But what the link was designed to do was to randomly present you with an image and a name of one of 2 people. Some of you, when you clicked on that link, you saw Barack Obama. Some of you, when you clicked on that link, you saw Osama bin Laden. Okay? Now, the person saying the quote probably had a pretty big impact on how you rated your agreement with the quote. So what I want you guys to do is go to Moodle, and you will see underneath the web lecture, enter your rating here, and you are going to click on the rating for A if you saw Barack Obama, and there will be a little rating scale, and you can just enter your rating there. If you saw Osama bin Laden, you will click on the other link that looks just like this little question mark dealy here, and you will enter your rating for B for Osama bin Laden. And then what I want you guys to do is check back later in the week. This will be part of the discussion for this week. What I predict is going to happen is people are going to be much more likely to agree with this statement when it is attributed to Barack Obama compared to when it is attributed to Osama bin Laden. But we'll see what happens. So go ahead and enter your rating and check back, and we'll see how it goes. Now, the reason why I predict that you'd be more likely to agree with this statement if you saw Barack Obama is that Barack Obama is seen as more credible than Osama bin Laden. Credibility has 2 components, right? Expertise, which is how competent the person is, right? How smart they are, the degree to which they are knowledgeable about their field, right? So if I tell you something or I try and persuade you to do something, if I am perceived as competent in that field, then you might be more persuaded by me, right? Knowledgeable, smart, well-spoken. Also, trustworthiness, right? If a person seems like they are trustworthy, right, then they are more credible. And sometimes we can base this information on stereotypes. So we sort of implicitly trust doctors more than we trust car salesmen, right? Doctors, the profession of doctor has the stereotype of being trustworthy. And so if a doctor comes on TV and endorses a particular product or tells you that one drug is particularly better for you than another drug, we're likely to believe them, to be persuaded by them because of this trustworthiness, because they are credible. Car salesmen, on the other hand, do not have a reputation for being trustworthy, and so we might be suspicious of what they have to say. This can also be based on personal experience with particular individuals. Another thing about trustworthiness is we tend to trust people who argue against their self-interest, right? So everyone has their own interests. For example, I might be interested in getting a 20% raise in my pay, but I might also be interested in seeing Chicago State University get some much-needed infrastructure improvements. Now, if I argue to the students that tuition needs to go up to pay for these infrastructure improvements, then you might be more likely to be persuaded by that if I also said, and you know what, I think that faculty salaries need to be decreased by 20% instead of increased, right? It's not in my interest for my salary to go down, but if I'm arguing for that, then I seem more trustworthy than I would otherwise. And you might be more persuaded by my message that we need to increase student tuition if you believe that I'm also arguing in favor of reducing my own salary. We're also persuaded by people that we like. You can think about like and dislike as some of those fundamental categories that our brain automatically categorizes people and objects into. Think about this from attitudes, things that we like, things that we don't like. If we classify someone as likable, we're more likely to be persuaded by them. We like people who are physically attractive, right? This is why pretty people are in commercials. We're also like people who are similar to us, right? You can think about different kinds of commercials that you see. Commercials take advantage of this all the time. So, for example, if you think about a commercial for cosmetic products, makeups, and the like, you're likely to see celebrities, particularly female celebrities. But if you think about commercials for products like bleach or dishwashing detergent, are you going to see celebrities? No, you're going to see physically attractive people, but they're going to be more similar to you. They're going to appear more similar to you, right? Because we like people who are similar to us. If we had, if we had a Brad Pitt trying to sell dishwasher detergent, it wouldn't work very well. We don't see Brad Pitt as the kind of person who does his own dishes, right? But someone who looks like us, who dresses like us, who shares our similar position and values, right? We like those people more. We're more likely to be persuaded by them. So those are some qualities of the speaker. There are also qualities of the message, content of the message that matters, right? So if you have weak arguments, right? So if you're not making very strong arguments, they're not well supported, there's not a lot of data or evidence to back up your position, then the number of arguments that you have influences how persuasive you are. If you have more arguments, then you will be more persuasive. Now again, this is especially if your audience is peripherally processing, right? If you're centrally processing, right, you'll see right through this strategy. But oftentimes, political figures will use this. They will have a number of arguments in support of their position, all of which are relatively weak, but just by having so many of them, they appear more persuasive. Also, complication can influence persuasiveness. The more complicated something sounds, the more persuasive that message can be. Ideally, or presumably what we think is going on here, is that complication increases your attributions of competence, right? If someone is spewing out very complicated information to you in support of a position, right, you might view them as more competent and thus more likely to be persuaded by their arguments. Also, speaking quickly is another thing that is very persuasive, especially when people are peripherally processing. If you speak quickly, you prevent people from sort of having the opportunity to think too much about the arguments that you're making. People who are in sales will often do this. If you've ever experienced one of those free weekends, free vacation weekends at one of those places that is trying to sell you a timeshare, right? This is part of their strategy. They will come in and they will speak quickly and they will move quickly, and you will leave that meeting feeling like, why wouldn't you buy this timeshare? It makes so much sense, right? So speaking quickly is another way that we can convey weak arguments persuasively. There's another influence on persuasion that has to do with the degree of difference between your position and where you are trying to be persuaded to change your position to. So the discrepancy of the argument takes this sort of inverted U shape, right? So the more extreme your argument is, the further away from the position that you hold, you are trying to be persuaded to, the harder it is to get you to change your attitude, right? Now, if you're really close to the position, right, if you support gay marriage and, you just think maybe, it should go through the courts or there should be a law for it, if you just have sort of a very somewhat discrepant position, it'll probably be very little attitude change that goes on. If you have a very extreme position, right, gay people should not be allowed to exist, right, sodomy should be illegal, right, if you have this very extreme position, then you're not going to be persuaded either. But if you're sort of in the middle, right, then you are more likely to experience greater attitudinal change, right? If your position is not too discrepant, then the persuasive message will be effective. Right? You want your message to be discrepant. You want to change their attitudes, but you don't want to change it too much, or you don't want to change it from a too extreme attitude. Other aspects of message content that really have an impact on whether or not you can persuade people has to do with fear. People are very, very sensitive. So generally speaking, people are very, very sensitive to negative information, much more so than positive information. And particularly, we are sensitive to things that make us afraid. So for example, in the news media, there is information about Ebola going on when I'm recording this lecture. There's sort of an Ebola outbreak in South Africa, and everyone is sort of very afraid of this Ebola epidemic. But the probability of getting infected with Ebola in the United States is so low, this sort of level of vitriol doesn't really make much sense. Right? But people are very, very motivated by fear. And so oftentimes when people are trying to persuade you using these fear appeals, they'll first make you afraid. So ads warning about cancer, bad breath, images on TV of people in body bags from drunk driving or smoking, right? So stir up some of that fear. And then provide the audience with directions on how to avoid those negative outcomes. Right, so you can think back to if you were paying attention during the 2004 presidential elections when Bush was up for re-election. This was one of their primary strategies, right? We will definitely be attacked by terrorists again. Fear, unless you vote for me, right? If you vote for Bush, we won't be attacked. We've kept you safe so far, and we'll continue to keep you safe again, right? So these fear appeals are very effective, especially when they're accompanied by directions to avoid these negative outcomes. If you recall from that sort of same 2004 era, the duct tape and plastic sheeting incidents where the government made an announcement that one way you could protect yourself from possible terrorist threat would be to cover your doors and windows with duct tape and plastic sheeting, and people went out in droves and they bought these items, right, from this sort of fear appeal. Positive messages also influence processing, but only to the extent that positive messages tend to put people into a peripheral processing mode, right? We're less sensitive, we pay less attention to positive information, and so if we hear positive information, it just makes it easier for us to kind of tune it out. Right? We want to be in a happy mood. We don't want to think. And when this happens, right, we sort of let our guard down, right? If you're telling me what I want to hear, I'm not going to think too critically about what you're saying. Sometimes we see this with the use of humor or upbeat music in commercials. One note about subliminal messages. Subliminal messages do not work to change attitudes. Subliminal messages cannot make you do things that you wouldn't otherwise normally do. If you think about priming from a couple weeks ago, priming can bump your cognitive processing just a little bit in one direction or the other, but it's not going to change your attitudes. It's not going to make you do something that you wouldn't normally do. Right? So subliminal messages do prime. Right, so if you're already thirsty and I prime you with, pictures of ice cold Coke, that might motivate you to go and get something to drink. And if you already like ice cold Coke, then that might also be enough to push you to buy that Coke. But you wouldn't do that if you weren't already thirsty and didn't already like Coke in the first place. Right, so priming does have an influence, but it doesn't cause people to do things that they wouldn't normally do. It doesn't change people's attitudes per se. We can talk about primacy versus recency. So all things being equal, if we've got a list of options, the information that's presented first usually has the most influence, as well as the information that is presented last. Right? Typically, especially when we have a long, series of arguments, right? We listen to the beginning, and then we start to slip into peripheral processing mode, pay less attention, and then maybe sort of come back into it, listen to the end. Oftentimes, you'll notice this with children. If you give children a list of 5 things, choose one of these 5 things. Typically, they're either going to choose the first thing you offer them or the last thing that you offer them because of the primacy and recency effects. So these are characteristics of the message. Last thing we'll talk about are characteristics of the audience. Right, so we already know that people who are motivated are going to pay more attention. But there's another individual difference, and this is a little quiz that you can take, and you can figure out your score here. So we've got 6 questions, and what I want you to do is go ahead and just pause the video and answer the following questions in your notes. Just write down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and then rate the degree to which you agree with the following statements, with 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree. All right, so I'm going to assume that you've gone through and you have rated all these items. Now, if you want to get your score on this quiz, what you're going to need to do is reverse code questions 2, 4, and 6. So 2, 4, and 6, what reverse coding means is we are going to flip your answers. So if for number 2, thinking is not my idea of fun, you put down in your notes 5, strongly agree, we're going to flip that to a 1, strongly disagree. Okay. For number 4, if you put down 2 in your notes, you're going to flip that to a 4, and a 3 will stay the same. So first you're going to reverse code questions 2, 4, and 6, and then what you're going to do is you're going to add up all of your answers, and you're going to get one number that represents your score on this quiz. Now, think about this for a minute. What do you think this scale measures? What do you think these quiz questions are getting at? This scale measures what we call need for cognition. Right? A need for cognition measures the degree to which you just sort of enjoy thinking about things. If you think back at these questions that we just had here, right? I really enjoy tasks that involves coming up with new solutions to problems, right? Questions like that, if you agree with those questions, right, you're the kind of person who is high in need for cognition. You really enjoy thinking, essentially. And people who are high in need for cognition are going to be more likely to process centrally than people who are low in need for cognition, who don't like to think about things. You guys want to know where you stand on the scale? Higher numbers mean greater need for cognition. And the scale has 6 questions that can range from 0 to 30. And so scores greater than 18 would be someone with high need for cognition. Less than 18 could indicate less need for cognition. You don't really need to know those cutoff values, but just think about this. Higher numbers mean greater need for cognition. So if you scored up there in the upper range of this scale, above 18, you probably have a high need for cognition. Lower range, low need for cognition. Other things, so this is a personality characteristic that can influence how you process persuasive messages. Also, forewarning is something that's going to influence, right? Persuasion only works if you aren't warned in advance that you are going to be persuaded. If someone comes to you and says, I am going to explain to you why you should change your attitude about the United States drone policy, right? Or some policy, or why you should change your attitude about Chicago State University's cafeteria food, right? If someone tells you they're trying to persuade you, this will make you less persuadable. You will be much more resistant to anything that they have to say. And we call this psychological reactance, right? People doing or believing the opposite of what they were told. Sometimes people talk about this as reverse psychology. Professionally, though, that is not a thing. We don't ever, professional psychologists don't ever talk about reverse psychology. We talk about it as reactance. people become reactionary. If I tell you, you're going to watch this movie and you are going to love this movie, it is the best movie ever, right? You might react against that a little bit. You're like, well, I don't know. We'll see. I'm not sure. I have to watch the movie and find out, right? If I try to persuade you, just go ahead and go to Bruce Rauner's website or some other political candidate's website and just read these couple paragraphs. It's really going to change your opinion of them. You will probably think to yourself, no, I don't think so. We experience this reactance because we like to maintain a sense of personal freedom. We don't like to believe that we are able to be persuaded by other people. We like to believe that we make all the decisions that we make from our own judgments and in the absence of influence of other people. All right, so that's it for this week. Make sure that you enter your score for the poll that we did, the live poll. Make sure you go back and check on the poll later in the week for the discussion. Don't forget the discussion posts and the quizzes for this week.